Hi, Olúfemi. You're very, very welcome to Transmedia Alley.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So I just wanted to give a very, very brief introduction before letting you go ahead with your talk. So Olúfemi Táíwò is assistant professor at Georgetown University and the author of two forthcoming books, Reconsidering Reparations, which is published in January 2022, and Elite Capture, published in May of 2022. Welcome, Olúfemi.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thanks everyone for being here. I'm really honored and grateful to get to talk through these issues, which are important to me, but I think, of course, are important to all of us. And as mentioned in the introduction, what I would like to talk about today centrally is planning and the role of planning in deciding political outcomes. I want to clarify from the outset that I don't mean that everything that happens on a world scale is planned out in advance by some particular small group of actors. I don't think that's a realistic portrayal of the complexities of planetary scale politics. But I do think that there are vast inequalities, not just in terms of the provision of resources or the provision of wealth, but there are vast inequalities in who's able to make plans at all, who is able to stabilize relationships to social systems and political systems across broad swaths of time. And that is intimately related to the other kinds of inequalities that we are more accustomed to talking about, inequalities of income, inequalities of wealth. And so, what I'm going to attempt to say in these 30 minutes is one perspective on the climate crisis that comes from thinking about those things, and that attempts to connect that kind of inequality to the more historically rooted inequalities that fall under the heading of reparations. So, a first step towards this kind of thought is thinking about climate crisis as also a political crisis. I think that much sooner than we think, we will find ourselves asking basic questions about how we're going to secure ourselves and our basic needs: food security, water, energy, housing. These are all things that are going to be sensitive not only to developments in the natural world, like sea level rise, but developments in our social world, developments in who has been displaced by climate events, developments in which kinds of political forces get hold of our institutions as xenophobia and racism shape people's responses to perceived scarcity. And it is getting those political questions right, balancing those political forces well, that I think will be largely decisive in the shape and extent of our climate crisis, broadly construed. So, movements and developments in the natural world will prompt responses from the social system, but it's actually the nature of the responses from the social system, especially in a world with the technological capabilities that ours has, that I think will largely decide the extent of the damage. This figure on this slide comes from an article in Nature by a variety of scientists, many of them natural scientists and many of them social scientists. And they noted the intersection of climate hazards like floods, wildfires, hurricanes, and heat waves with the COVID-19 pandemic. The suggestion they were making was, of course, not that the COVID-19 pandemic would cause wildfires or typhoons or bushfires, but rather that the same social system that we use to respond to heat waves, floods, and bushfires, the same state capacity, the same set of non-governmental organizations and actors, the same relief agencies will be stressed by the COVID-19 pandemic at the same time that they're stressed by these other things. And in fact, from a social systemic standpoint, these crises are compounding even though they come about for largely causally independent reasons. That is a short-term version of, I think, a longer-term insight that I've been working through, alongside generations of scholars and intellectuals and activists. And whether we're thinking on the scale of a few years of a pandemic, or whether we're thinking on a much larger scale of decades of industrial planning and zoning and development, we see a tight relationship between political structures and environmental outcomes that follows a more indirect kind of causal pathway. So on the left side of this screen, you see one kind of statistic that people find quite often. This is from the United States, where I'm based as a scholar. A report in the 1980s showed that 3 out of 5 Latino and Black Americans lived near a toxic waste site, and the number for white Americans was much lower. That's, of course, not because there's any necessary connection between those demographic categories and toxic waste, but there is nevertheless a causal connection between who it is that our social systems direct the most and worst vulnerabilities to, and how those social systems have been constructed in general. So over the past few centuries, we have built a planet-sized social and economic system. There's a global social structure that is the result of transatlantic slavery and colonialism. I call this global racial empire. Other people have thought of it under the heading of racial capitalism. Whatever term you use to describe it, it is a planetary system. And I think something that's broadly true about that planetary system is that it is a distributive system. It decides what things, it is a set of processes that produces things for global consumption along capitalist logics. And it also distributes them. It not only says what things will be produced and at what scale, and that marks them for marks them for production as commodities to be sold to accumulate capital, but it decides where they go. And that is also politically important. In particular, I think social scientists find that the distributive system has some broad patterns, that social advantages tend to accumulate in global north and in racially dominant communities. So very tangible things like wealth tend to accumulate in the global north, but also other kinds of social advantages that are perhaps harder to understand as individually distributable resources. Things like knowledge and research capacity also tend to accumulate in the global north. And similarly, by the same token, social disadvantages accumulate in the global south. Things like toxic waste build up in the global south and in racially disadvantaged communities. Things like poverty, things like susceptibility to violence tend to accumulate in these parts of the world, these countries of the world that make up the global south, and also in racially disadvantaged communities, both in the global north relative to their neighbors and in the global south. This is a result that seems to hold at multiple levels of scale. So if we pick a particular country and we look within that country, we tend to find a disproportionate amount of social disadvantages like wealth, poverty, and toxic waste concentrated in racially disadvantaged communities, like Black and Indigenous communities. And we also tend to find those kinds of disproportionate distributions across countries or regions of the world. So if that's what we're responding to with reparations, if transatlantic slavery and colonialism built a racist world order, a distribution system that operates in this way, then I think the proper task of reparations should match that same scale. It should be to remake the world. Now, previous movements for anti-colonial justice and racial justice have, I think, already had this kind of recognition. There's the history of the national independence movements that followed the Second World War that had a recognition of the scale of this task. They argued for constructing a new international economic order, for example, that would provide a whole new set of relationships for countries, including the newly independent countries that had just won independence from their former colonial overlords. And I think that scale of analysis is what fits the idea of reparations broadly. So if the world here is considered as a production distribution system, we can consider things like racial injustice or colonial injustice on these same terms. So security, political power, resources, and money are also moved this way and that way by this distribution system. And changing how they're distributed is key to racial justice, understood in this way. So where I want to go from here is by taking these broad kind of abstract ways of thinking about racial justice broadly and apply them a bit more specifically to the kinds of things that we're worried about in climate crisis. What is this broad kind of distributive description of the world order and things, senses in which it might be going wrong, tell us about ecological, environmental, climate-based crisis and disaster? And so the point that I want to make, also a point that has been made earlier by scholars, in particular Amartya Sen, who I'll talk about in these next sections. We shouldn't think that these ecological systems and seemingly ecological or environmental consequences are a different sort than the kind we're thinking of in the abstract when we think of racial injustice or colonial injustice. One, I think, particularly suggestive area of scholarship and history is the unfortunate history of famines, which you could think of as extreme food insecurity, right? So one of the most basic forms of material security that our planet scale social system, our planet scale economic system would hopefully provide to all the people who live on this planet. Famines used to be a lot more common everywhere, even in the advantaged parts of the world, until around the middle of the 19th century. And one way of explaining famines that was certainly applicable in earlier periods of human history was to explain them by way of what's happening in the natural world. So Amartya Sen calls this older way of thinking about famines the food availability decline approach. And that way of explaining famines is intuitive. Famines happen when there isn't enough food. And the reason that there isn't enough food is something that happened in the natural world exclusively. Perhaps there was an infestation of a particular kind of pest, a fungus, or an insect. Perhaps rainfall through natural variability was either less or more than expected. So droughts or floodings, either of which can ruin crop yields. And older versions of explaining famines used to rely on those kinds of explanations, the kinds of explanations of famines and the resulting kinds of explanations of pressures on populations that think primarily about the activity of the natural world itself. This is the kind of view that you get from the Reverend Malthus or from Smith. And Sen noticed a change that had happened because of the planet-sized system and the technological changes that were caused by the creation of a planet-sized system of economics and trade. Trade networks got larger and began to respond to more environmental outcomes. A drought in France, for example, could be compensated for by crop yields in Brazil, for example. And modern technological agricultural techniques also helped make possible a different set of responses to changes in the natural world and made possible different levels of robustness to changes in the natural world. But these changes did not stop famines. There were still large famines that are happening now. There are people experiencing extreme food insecurity even now when we produce enough food to meet famine and hunger. In particular, in Sen's time, there was a number of major famines, in particular one in Bengal, in a region of India where Amartya Sen is from. And this can't be explained simply by appeal to problems in the natural world. So Sen developed a newer approach. He called it the entitlement approach or the exchange entitlement approach. Just for the sake of connecting it to the point here for today, I'm just going to refer to it as the political approach. But the basic thrust of the point that Amartya Sen was making, the economist and philosopher, was that famines happen when distribution systems fail to secure vulnerable people. When we fail to secure vulnerable people. One of the case studies that led him to this conclusion was the aforementioned Great Bengal Famine of 1943. Some 3 million people died in this famine, overwhelmingly concentrated in rural Bengal. And this famine was initially blamed on low rainfall by colonial authorities. Then India was still under the colonial domination of the British Empire. However, Sen argued that food availability was unchanged through some data analysis that he did in the 1970s. And later researchers, Mishra and other researchers, went back and looked at rainfall patterns and actually found that rainfall had increased, not to monsoon or flooding levels, but it contradicted the narrative that the British Empire had given for why it was that there was a Great Bengal famine. They also found that there were droughts later on in India's history. A few years after this, India would gain independence from the British Empire. And these actual droughts after democratization did not lead to famine. So despite the fact that there were similar events in the natural world as the kind of events that the British Empire used to explain the famine, the relationship between low rainfall and mass starvation turned out to turn on political dynamics, on who it was that was in charge, who it was that was able to make plans about food distribution, when it was the British Empire empowered to make plans about food distribution. The people who lived in Bengal were subject to food insecurity on the basis of those plans. And when it was up to the people of India, as imperfect as all democracies are, they made different decisions about who is going to be vulnerable and why. So these research suggests, Sen, Mishra, and colleagues, it was the political background of these decisions that was decisive. Those of you who are history buffs maybe might have noticed the year, 1943. Of course, this is during the Second World War. The actual explanation of the famine, many researchers suggest, was securitization of resources. It's not that there wasn't enough food to keep the people of Bengal in a position to eat, but rather the amount of food that was available was made a part of a securitization effort. In particular, the British Empire trying to make sure that they had consistent supplies for their war effort, for their soldiers, including the many the many people from British colonies who were pressed into imperial service, and making sure that they had secure food storage and food supplies for that effort involved plans that didn't involve people in Bengal living and that were amenable to having them die by the millions. In particular, invasion by Japanese forces nearby invasion by Japanese forces compounded these security issues. The British Empire even destroyed fishing boats that people in Bengal could have used to provide food for themselves that they couldn't get at the market, because they feared that Japanese forces might commandeer those and use them as part of their war efforts. So putting all these things together, it is British colonial economic policies that caused the famine. Or we could say British colonial war planning that caused the famine, but not something that was an artifact of the people of Bengal being at the mercy of the natural world. Amartya Sen looks back on these lessons and uses it to reject the food availability decline approach as the only way of thinking about famines, or perhaps even as the primary way of thinking about famines in a social system and a global economic system that has the features that ours has, that is at least potentially robust against the kinds of things that, the kinds of problems that nature can throw at us. Famines happen when distribution systems fail to secure vulnerable people. So what I'm suggesting is that we take a similar point of view on climate change. We desperately need knowledge about our natural systems, and it is utterly indispensable, the kind of knowledge that geologists and climate scientists and people who work on various kinds of engineering that are necessary for climate adaptations. We absolutely need all of that knowledge and all of that input from the natural sciences. But one of the things that we're learning about through that work is what the stresses will be on our political and distribution systems. What kinds of political systems and distribution systems are going to be robust against the kinds of shocks and the kinds of pressures that our global emissions are going to put on our natural systems. And it is the response of our political and distribution systems to those pressures that I think we have reason to think will be decisive in terms of outcomes, in terms of deciding which people will be made vulnerable, and in terms of deciding to what extent that vulnerability will translate into particular kinds of outcomes, whether we're talking about mass death, displacement, food insecurity, housing insecurity, warehousing of people along borders. Those are all not decided by our natural systems, but decided by what we do about them. So if we have the kinds of distribution systems, politically speaking, socially speaking, that make money, protective equipment, comprehensive schemes of insurance, climate robust, resilient food systems and energy systems prevalent. There's actually a lot about natural systems that are survivable or at least significantly mitigatable problems. In the absence of those kinds of comprehensive responses, disaster can strike on a scale of genocide. So it's the second approach that we should take. Here is the approach that our social system currently takes. On the left side of the screen is a set of descriptive statistics that shows us how mortality rates due to pollution are distributed. This functions as a sort of explanation of one kind of indicator that you could use for broadly how environmental vulnerability is distributed, broadly speaking, across the world. So environmental vulnerability in the present. And on the right is climate vulnerability in the future. So how we can expect our social systems to produce and distribute climate vulnerability on a global scale. These are box plots. So the boxes represent most countries who fit into either of these categories. On the left, you see that most countries that have not been colonized have much lower rates of mortality than most countries that have. On the right, you see that most countries that have been colonized face higher rates of higher levels of climate change vulnerability as measured by a particular index that was put together by researchers at the University of East Anglia. That's, of course, not to say that colonialism, that planting a flag somewhere, was some decision about where toxic waste was going to be shipped in direct terms. But the relationship is not conceptual or coincidental. It's causal. There are a variety of social scientists. There are a variety of explanations that social scientists put forward for why it is that the world works this way. But the descriptive statistics kind of say it all. It's simply true that the world does, in fact, work this way. That the parts of the world that have less money and the parts of the world that have had fewer years of political autonomy are also the parts of the world where pollution is concentrated disproportionately, and also parts of the world where the broad kinds of things that make one vulnerable to climate change, which include things that include factors that are geographic, what is the sea level in a place, but also include facts that relate to state capacity. What's the ability of the political forces to respond to disasters of a natural kind or any other kind? What are the ability of actual physical structures as well as social structures to respond to low levels of resources? How resilient is the housing stock against disasters? How resilient are the food distribution networks against disasters? And when we ask these broader questions, we find the same kinds of patterns across the world, across the various countries of the world that we find in wealth, that we find in the number of research universities, also concentrated in the global north. These measures of climate change vulnerability or of pollution follow the same patterns as many of the other kinds of things that we track. So, if the world has been created as a distribution network, and if it is true that, broadly speaking, that distribution network tends to generate outcomes that shifts advantages towards the global north and to racially advantaged populations, white populations, and distributes disadvantages towards the global south and to Black and Indigenous populations, to racially disadvantaged populations, then justice, climate reparations, involves us doing the opposite as we move towards justice in our global distributions. As we move towards justice, as we move towards comprehensive responses to the climate crisis. That is not to say that it's a different project than responding to the climate crisis, but thinking about historical distributions tells us how we should respond to the climate crisis. So if you spend a little bit of time thinking about the kinds of categories of climate change response or climate policy, you might recognize these 5 bullet points below here. They are standard categories in climate change discussion. Mitigation refers to efforts to lower emissions in countries or corporations. Adaptation refers to efforts to make our social systems robust against different kinds of climate calamities. Loss and damage refers to things that we might do after climate calamities. So, in the wake of a climate influenced cyclone, for example. Resettlement refers to what we would do after climate displacement. And carbon removal refers to what we would do after having emitted carbon.
Olúfẹ, just to let you know, we have about 3 minutes left in the segment, so we're going to have to ask you to wrap up or conclude pretty rapidly.
Yes. So I'll skip to saying this. Environmental justice activism emphasizes the inseparability of economic well-being with the kinds of environmental distributions that I've pointed out, and points to the control of financial and other resources in envisioning a climate justice future. And that involves putting different people, as Amartya Sen and the researchers of Famine in Bengal found, in charge of what is going to happen in our social systems and how they work. That is going to involve grassroots planning, broadly democratic planning, rather than planning for shareholders and rather than planning by colonial empires and the countries that stand atop our global political system. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olúfẹ, for a fascinating talk. I think we probably don't really have any time for any kind of detailed discussion because we have about 2 minutes left in our segment. So probably ask listeners on the stream or watchers on the stream to, if you have further questions or comments for Olúfẹ, you can post them to the Telegram chat and we can relay them on to him. Yeah, I think we probably don't even. I actually have a bunch of questions I'd really like to ask you, but my sense is we probably don't really have any time to get into the discussions about your talk. So I'd just like to say thank you very, very much, Olúfẹ, for really, really kind of comprehensive and quite like pragmatic talk as well, where you're sort of providing us with, I guess, a toolkit for thinking about some of these problems going forward. So thank you so much.
Thank you.